Aerobic energy production during exercise. Part 1, carbohydrates. Yes, the oxygen referred to in aerobic exercise is really needed to make energy to keep you going. But it's only needed at the very end, yet somehow gets all the credit. Kind of like that wimpy kicker who's only on the field for 5 seconds yet kicks the winning field goal. Now it's hydrogen that does all the heavy lifting when it comes to making aerobic energy, or ATP. During exercise we can tell when more oxygen is being delivered to the muscles by the increase in breathing and heart rate. But where does hydrogen come from? Well, it comes from the food you eat, particularly carbohydrates and fats, which during digestion get broken down to glucose and fatty acids respectively. The hydrogen is only one of 3 elements along with oxygen and carbon that make up the glucose and fatty acids. This oxygen can't help with energy production because it, along with the carbon, is removed as carbon dioxide. So the hydrogens are left with a big task of making most of the energy needed during exercise. I cover how fat or fatty acid is used to make energy in a separate video. As glucose enters the muscle cell, it's either stored as glycogen or it's further broken down by enzymes through a series of reactions called glycolysis. At the beginning of glycolysis, 2 phosphates from ATP are used to keep glucose inside the cell and to stabilize it so it can be further broken down. At this point, the muscle fibers used energy instead of produced it. So glucose needs to be further broken down, where its energy is eventually used to combine with ADP and phosphate to make ATP. This happens 4 times, so glycolysis uses 2 ATP to get things going, but produces 4 ATP, for a net gain of 2 ATP. Along the way, glycolysis also pulls off some of the hydrogens, which are attached to transport molecules called NAD and FAD, that take the hydrogens to the mitochondria. Back to what's left of glucose. At the end of glycolysis, we're left with a small remnant of glucose, called pyruvate, which can also enter the mitochondria. But with anaerobic energy production, which I cover in another video, the hydrogen and the pyruvate are left outside the mitochondria and are involved in the production of lactate. Inside the mitochondria, the pyruvate enters another series of reactions, known as the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. Here it's broken down to its carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, where the carbon and oxygen form CO2 and the hydrogen's attached to more NADs and FADs. The citric acid cycle also produces 1 ATP, which becomes an available energy source for muscle contraction. But depending on the efficiency of all this, an NADH will eventually provide 2 to 3 ATP, while an FADH will eventually provide 1.5 to 2 ATP. You may see or hear QH2 instead of FADH. And I won't go into the differences, but places like the Khan Academy provide a deep dive into this whole process, also known as cellular respiration. So how do the hydrogens on the NAD and FAD produce ATP? Well, that's where the electron transport chain comes in. The NADH and FADH travel to the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, where the hydrogens are dropped off. The NAD and the FAD can then go back to the citric acid cycle to pick up more, kind of like Uber for hydrogens. At the inner membrane, the hydrogens have their electrons removed, which sounds painful. But the electrons undergo a series of reactions as they move down the inner membrane, with the help of iron-containing proteins called cytochromes. Those reactions pump the hydrogen into the space between the inner and outer membrane. This forms a very high concentration of hydrogens between the 2 membranes, which eventually pushes the hydrogens back through the inner membrane at specific locations called ATP synthase. As the hydrogens move through, it causes ATP synthase to spin like a turbine, which captures energy and combines with ADP and phosphate to form ATP. Meanwhile, once the electrons pass all the cytochromes, they reunite with hydrogen and then combine with oxygen to form water. Finally, oxygen shows up, but without that oxygen, the hydrogens remain between the 2 membranes and the electrons get stuck on the inner membrane. This would back up not just the electron transport chain, but the citric acid cycle as well, resulting in a sharp decline in ATP production. This is why oxygen gets so much recognition, even though it's only involved in the last step of aerobic energy production. Another reason is that we can measure this amount of oxygen used, which gives us a relative idea of how much ATP is produced aerobically. The volume and speed or rate at which oxygen is used inside the mitochondria to make ATP is measured as VO2, which can be used to calculate how many calories are burned during exercise and where those calories came from, carbohydrate or fat. And that's how your muscles use carbohydrate to make ATP during exercise. Post your questions below and watch my other videos on aerobic energy production from fat and how all this energy production improves with aerobic training. Thanks for watching. And as always, my answers come from peer-reviewed research.